Montana is beautiful. It has towering mountains, broad valleys, and a massive prairie that together make it one of the most stunning places on Earth. When people think of Montana, they think of its treasures, surely its land, but also treasures beneath the earth, gold, silver, and copper. The state motto, Oro y Plata, gold and silver, represents Montana's siren call, which beckoned treasure seekers to Montana. Montana became the proverbial El Dorado, inviting explorers as well as settlers to come and partake. The state has, and always will, entice the world, bringing people to its treasures, beauty, and serenity. Yet the treasures of Montana were not harvested without a price. They came only through bad and even ugly times. Treasure seekers repeatedly exploited the land to its full extent, leaving its waste as a problem for people in the future. The toll was high and the price steep, paid by many who could least afford the fee. We need to know Montana's history. We need to calculate the cost Montana has paid. Only then will we appreciate its treasures. As John Muir once stated, "The mountains are calling and I must go."
Before Europeans came to Montana, there were so many different tribes of Native Americans here, it's hard to even count and keep them straight. But they all had one thing in common, and that was land. And yeah, of course there was conflict before the Euro-American explorers came and gave them guns and horses and diseases, but at least they were all linked together by one thing, and that was the buffalo. The biggest part of Indian culture is that they believed that the land wasn't something that you owned, it was something respected, because everything had a spirit. The rocks, the mountains, the animals, the plants, everything. Some Indian tribes had prophets that began foretelling the coming of the white man. And we don't know if this was actually due to visions or if it was just due to rumors getting pushed farther and farther west as Americans expanded. As Dominic Mitchell was quoted in I Will Be Meat for My Salish, to needlessly kill buffalo was a very grave crime. Then, too, before the Good Fathers came, our Indians believed the buffalo was a very strong spirit power and was a good friend to Indians who protected the herds. Sweet Medicine, a northern Cheyenne prophet living generations before the white man arrived, told his tribe that they will try to change you from your way of living to theirs, and they will keep it what they try to do. They will work with their hands, they will tear up the earth, and at last you will do it with them. When you do, you will become crazy and forget all that I am now teaching you.
Near the end of the 17th century, profit-hungry fur companies turned their eyes westward. The abundance of beaver drew fur trappers, planting the seeds of a new economy based on the exploitation of natural resources. The beaver is an integral part of wetland ecosystems. The dams they build alleviate droughts and floods, lessen erosion, raise the water table, and purify water. With the near extinction of the furry critters, Montana's landscape altered and its waterways suffered. Early fur traders peacefully interacted with the native tribes, but the trading of guns, whiskey, and modern metal tools and conveniences created a consumer desire among the tribes that hadn't previously existed. While the modern tools enhanced the Indians' way of life, they also created a novel state of leisure, which in turn led to increased intertribal warfare. To obtain more of these white conveniences, Indians began killing for fur and leaving the unused carcasses, something that conflicted with their shamanistic beliefs and affected a change in cultural core values within their society. Along with the fur traders, priests also entered the territory, bringing cultural unrest as they attempted to save the heathen souls of the native tribes. At first, the tribes were covetous of visiting black robes. This, of course, led to war when their priest would visit enemy tribes. Along with the gifts of cultural unrest and increased warfare, priests and fur traders also brought waves of smallpox that devastated the tribal populations, leaving them unable to fight the large fur companies who then established trading forts, displacing the native tribes, and beginning the influx of immigrants into the territory.
In one Montana history textbook, it says, "The discovery of gold changed the landscape of Montana. Mines multiplied in the gulches. Towns sprang up nearby, farms spread through the valleys, ancient trails and pathways became wagon roads. Gold also created a new economic pattern in Montana, the boom and bust cycle. Each gold discovery brought sudden activity followed by decline, then a period of quiet, and then a sudden burst of activity again in another location. This boom and bust cycle defined Montana's economy during the gold rush era, and it continued to shape life in Montana and all across the West for the next 100 years. Mining conditions for the miners were poor and unhealthy. There were no rules or regulations, and many died on the job. With these newfound treasures, white Montanans developed a nativist, Montana first attitude as Chinese immigrants came hoping to strike it rich. By the end of 1851, there were approximately 25,000 Chinese on the Pacific coast. As Montana's population of Chinese increased, some estimate that it was as high as 50% of the population. The gossip and rumors about their habits turned to hatred and acts of violence. Montana Post declared, "We are opposed, upon principle, to the importation of Chinese into this country. They are a manifest disadvantage to it in many ways. There are so many vampires sucking the lifeblood out of any portion in which they remain." Hydraulic mining was introduced in 1867. Pressurized streams of water washed down the dirt and left behind piles of rock and hydraulic cuts in the land. From 1898 through 1922, the hydraulic system left behind chewed-up ground. It destroyed several communities in the path and left behind distinctive tailings and dredge ponds.
In the 1800s, copper was in very high demand, but it was also very devastating to our environment. While the mines in Montana were some of the richest in the world, Montana and its people did not share in this wealth. Profits and riches went to the big business magnates of that time. William Andrews Clark and Marcus Daly, the Copper Kings. Known for the battles they fought in Butte, Montana over the control of the local copper mining industry. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company dominated Montana's economy, politics, journalism, even the state legislature. We burned heaps containing unwanted elements, including arsenic and sulfur dioxide. Out-of-state newspapers labeled Butte the smoking city of sin. The smoke mixed with moisture and caused acid rain, killing trees, grass, and wildlife, as well as 200 people of Butte. They came, ruined the land, took all our resources, and left the waste.
When the homesteaders would come out here, a lot of them would come with just, one or two of their family members, try and make it work, and then send for the rest of their family members. Women would come without family members. A lot of Montana homesteaders were women, single, unmarried women. There was a lot of distance between these homesteads, so there was a sense of isolation, loneliness during the winters, because the water systems were not, the wells were so awful. There was a high rate of infant mortality. Children under the age of 5 would die from all kinds of diseases. It was not an easy life for these people. They found they couldn't farm the land. It was dry, it was barren, it was desert. They couldn't irrigate it like they were supposed to, and that great dream turned into dust, and they left. One of the worst things I think that happened was the Dawes Act, saying, hey, guess what? You can come on out here, cheap, free Indian land. And millions of acres of Indian reservation land was lost and given and sold to white settlers. And the Indians were never able to reclaim those reservation lands.
By the late 1860s, the rest of the nation wanted greater access to Montana's treasure trove. The answer? Railroads. Railroads offered speedy, low-cost travel and shipping, but they needed land to be built, and that land was taken from the already displaced native people. Reservation land was reduced by 17 million acres to accommodate the various railways. U.S. troops invaded the territory, killing any Indian who dared defend their land. In order to break the will of the natives, Generals Sherman and Sheridan led the initiative to decimate the vast herds of buffalo that roamed the grassy ranges. When the buffalo no longer roamed the plains, the native people lost the will to fight. They moved to the reservations and bowed to the will of the American government, living on handouts and allotments. The Native Americans weren't the only ones to suffer. The building of the railroads cost many thousands of lives. Immigrants were abused, underpaid, and buried along the routes. Mostly, those abused were of Asian descent, Japanese and Chinese, a continued nativism stemming from the gold rush days and the sadly mistreated Chinese populace.
The thing about the Wild West is that people nowadays think of the Wild West as cowboys and drifters and young guns, all of those Hollywood movie characters. However, Montana life was not glamorous, it was not glorious, it was rough and tough and hard. The reason why we romanticize Montana as this Wild West place is because of the Vigilantes. If you don't know who the Vigilantes are, basically they were this group of people that wanted to end the influence of a corrupt sheriff named Henry Plummer and his equally corrupt deputies in Bannock, Montana. They've had such a lasting impact that even our modern-day highway patrol uses their symbols. But they weren't necessarily as committed to law and order as romantic versions of them might have you think. For instance, in the first 2 months of 1864, they hung 24 men without a passing thought, let alone a fair trial. The Vigilantes would leave warnings on the doors of their potential targets in the form of the numbers 3777. It's still a mystery today what those numbers mean, but we just know that they were a warning. Some people in Montana, of course, fought back against the Vigilantes. One Montana town threatened to kill 5 Vigilantes for every one of their citizens that the Vigilantes killed.
Starting in the 1880s, the government wanted to assimilate Indian people into the melting pot of America. They put them into institutions where they were taught to forget their traditional ways and learn the culture and customs of normal American people. Many children were removed from their families and placed into government-run boarding schools. The government believed the young Indian people would adopt the values and practical knowledge of the dominant American society. The Dawes Act was the government's 57-year attempt to forcefully integrate Native American Indians into white societies. Thankfully, the Roosevelt administration passed the Indian Reorganization Act, returning rights to the Indians and allowing them to form their own governments.
Now, the progressive movement was nationwide, but Montana had its own as well, fighting big businesses, implementing social change, and fighting for the little man, if you will. Montana's history has been largely characterized by large corporations taking away profits, as well as quality of life from Montana, such as the railroad companies and the Copper Kings. But with big business comes an influx of people, and quote-unquote civilization must come with them. But Montana was still this Wild West, except families were coming in, and that began to take precedence, which influenced the beginning of change. This was the era of prohibition, labor unrest, and community beautification as people finally began to care about their state and the environment. This reminds me of a quote that Jeanette Rankin said. She said, "You take people as far as they will go, not as far as you would like them to go." Jeanette Rankin is the perfect example of progressivism in Montana. The first woman to be elected to Congress. My absolute favorite quote of hers is, "Men and women are like right and left hands. It doesn't make sense not to use both." But of course, none of this happened without drawbacks, especially prohibition, which almost completely backfired against its supporters, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Because previously women weren't allowed into saloons and other areas where gambling and imbibement were rampant, the emergence of private speakeasies led women to participating with less of a stigma, and alcohol sales actually went up after prohibition began.
The price paid for Montana during World War I and II, I would have to say The population, 10% enlisted for both wars, World War I and World War II. 57,000 for World War II and 40,000 for World War I. It decimated the population of Montana at that point in time. It affected the life in the mines. They were looking for people to work in the mines and the logging camps. It was inexperienced help, so the inexperienced help was more prone to have accidents and get hurt on the job. Wartime inflation increased the cost of living and ate up more of the miners' paychecks than ever. While the miners' profits skyrocketed, miners' wages did not rise enough to keep up with inflation. The price of food in Butte, Montana increased 41% in 2 years. Rents doubled. Most miners had to borrow money just to live. The miners grew poorer and poorer even though they were working harder and faster than ever. The Sedition Act of World War I pretty much took away free speech from the people as far as speaking ill about the war. If you weren't for the war, then you were against it and you were enemy of the state. The government encouraged farmers to take on more debt during World War I to help feed the soldiers and feed people in Europe as well. They acquired more land and planted more crops, and it was all well and fine until the war ended and people came back home, and then the prices dropped back down and the debts kind of hurt the farmers. Demand for the state's natural resources fell to its pre-war levels. Prices dropped and people lost jobs. A devastating and long-lasting drought drove 70,000 homesteaders off the land. Homesteaders who may have survived were driven under by war debt. Soldiers returned from war to find their farms ruined by drought. Farm towns shriveling up, families destitute, and jobs hard to find. Many of them came back to homes where family members had died from influenza. Bitterness between people was hard to stop once it started. Even after the war ended, Montana kept its ban on speaking German in public into the 1920s. And no one arrested for sedition during the war was released when the war was over. All of them served out their sentences.
The Cold War affected the entire nation, not only urging the government to spend millions of dollars on military and scientific endeavors to keep ahead of the Russians, but spreading a livid fear of nuclear attack to plague daily life. Even here in Montana, government organized scores of civilians that would scan the skies, searching for enemy aircraft that might not show up on radar. Letty Pierce Gilbert, a volunteer from St. Ignatius and mother of 5, was tasked to report and describe every aircraft that flew overhead. She said, "Every time you were doing something, there'd go a plane." The fear caused paranoia and delusional behavior. Neighbors accused one another of communist activity and turned friends against one another, leading to irrational outbursts. Responses to the Korean and Vietnam Wars were vastly different from World War I and World War II. The previous wars had seen a mostly united support front, but these new wars were different, and some Montanans joined those who felt it morally wrong to send their young men to die in someone else's civil war. Montanans joined anti-war protests, marches and rallies in Washington, D.C., and some even organized events in Montana, favoring college campuses for venues. The Cold War fear affected political elections as well, changing how people vote based on what candidates would be supporting increased military programs. One of these programs was responsible for bringing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, to Montana. ICBMs are missiles that are armed and ready to fire at any continent as we see fit, with a predetermined path. Military leaders felt that if we had these pointing at the Soviets at all times, the sneaky Reds would think twice about attacking us. Montanans became more and more dependent on their land for survival. The Anaconda Company employed almost everyone. When profits became greater from their mines in Chile, they moved to open-pit mining in Butte. In the last-ditch effort to make more profit from the mine, open-pit mining dramatically changed Butte as the growing pit swallowed homes, churches, and even schools. New oil fields were discovered all over the state and refineries were built to process the petroleum, and by 1960, the revenue surpassed that made by the copper industry, greatly helping to revive the state's flagging economy. But the environmental impact of these refineries is still being battled today, leaking oil and gas poisons in the air we breathe and the land we use to grow food, not to mention the water we drink. Montana's dams altered the state's politics, landscape, and economy. With many new houses and businesses needing power and farms needing irrigation, dams were created to produce both. With the erection of the Hungry Horse Dam, a federally owned project, the local economy was once again altered. For years, the Anaconda Company had purchased its energy from the local-owned Montana Power. But with the new dam drawing Anaconda away, the partnership gradually dissolved, and the local revenue was once again being diverted out of the state. Television and radio connected Montanans to the rest of the world. For the first time, they were able to see and hear what was going on in the world without having to depend on local news sources that could be corrupted sources depending on what company, Anaconda, owned the publications. Adding to the consumer culture that spawned during this time, Montanans flocked to the stores to purchase these new electronic wonders. But with this newfound freedom came a new danger. Whatever was shown or expressed on the TV was believed. The people didn't take into consideration that the broadcast companies were still owned by the corporations with agendas. The advertisements alone spawned a culture of consumers. The people had to buy what the men and women in the ads told them to. You don't have the newest oven? Then your household is Stone Age, lacking. Your poor wife is suffering because she can't cook with electricity or wash and dry with machinery. In 1956, the government responded to the military's need for an efficient network of high-speed roads that would allow them to move about the country as quickly as possible. The Federal Highway Act spawned interstate highways that connected the major cities, but this meant the death of cities and towns that were bypassed. Towns that weren't close enough to the new highways or close enough to a major city that a person could commute dwindled away.
72 Constitution for Montana was a big turning point for the state. The people, the farmers got together, the students got together. There was huge grassroots movements as far as politics went. Everybody became one. Didn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent. They were all got together and they were upset. Anaconda Company had lost money in Chile. Chile had locked down their mines and cost them millions of dollars, so that stretched into Montana where they laid off thousands of people from Butte. And then along with that, there was a North Central Power study that wanted to turn Montana into the boiler room for the rest of the nation. They wanted to start coal mining and strip mining the land to supply electric energy for all the rest of the nation. They proposed 21 plants to go into Montana, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Montanans got together through the 60s and 70s. There had been little movements here and there to where finally it came about to where a vote happened, and there was a 1972 Constitution Convention, and they elected 100 delegates from all walks of life. You had lawyers on there, you had educators, people who were fresh out of school, all walks of life were part of the delegates, and they were elected by the people. And if you held office in Montana, you couldn't be part of the delegation from what the old Constitution said. So the delegates were all just normal people every day. And the Constitution that came out of it was huge. It's a big deal. It's renowned worldwide. Everybody takes a look at the Montana Constitution for what it has inside of it, what was placed inside of it. The rights given to the people of Montana were huge at the point in time. There's nothing like it anywhere else. As stated in the preamble to the 1972 Constitution, we, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, to ordain and establish this Constitution.
After the energy boom in the late 70s in Montana actually went into a depression in the 80s, which was different than a lot of the rest of the country. ARCO had bought out Anaconda. ARCO was one of the most profitable oil and gas companies, and it couldn't make a profit in Montana. And by 1985, they closed down all the mining. The pumps that would drain the mines of the waste materials were shut off, and the Berkeley pit was just left to fill full of wastewater. So the water table raises about 2 feet a month, and within the next 5 years they anticipate that it'll go into the groundwater here, and this is poisonous water. Birds that have flown into it have died, and that's what we were left with. The mill companies were major employers in the state of Montana. But when the government decided to regulate timber cutting on public lands, the loggers, the mill workers, were not able to make a living because 60% of Montana is public lands. So they weren't able to harvest trees. NAFTA affected us greatly. We were able to import timber from Canada cheaper than what we could produce here in Montana, so it really affected us. So a lot of people lost their jobs. We drive around town and you'd see this home, this family is supported by timber dollars, signs everywhere. You don't see those anymore. Montana is now a tourist destination. 9.8 million visitors come to Montana every year. That's 10 times the amount of residents we have. It does result in a huge amount of jobs, and the economic impact is $2.75 billion a year. It brings in a lot of money to the state. What made Montana wonderful is disappearing. Because as people move here, as they immigrate from these large urban cities, we become no better than the urban sprawl that these people left behind. You can't live on the scenery. I think the thing that is most difficult is these families that have had land and homes here for generations, farms that they've passed down to their children and their grandchildren. Due to the high cost of our property taxes, because so many people are moving in, the tax burden on the land has become so great that our children can no longer inherit the property that we had. Montana is at a crossroads. We can either move forward and embrace the changes and become a better, a stronger, more economically sound state, or we can continue the way we always have. Use up the resources, move on to something else, plod along, and let things happen to us as a state, rather than us choose to make things happen.
I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. Theodore Roosevelt.